Okay, so I should start by saying hi, everyone. I am Nas from Anamet, and happy to have you all here today to our book talk titled Iconoclasm Then and Now, during which Aaron Tugendhaft's new book, The Idol of Isis, From Assyria to the Internet, will be discussed by art historians and Anamet's former fellows, Christiane Gruber and Ömür Harmanşah, together with Aaron Tugendhaft, writer himself. The discussion will focus on two main questions. What underlies the persistent drive to destroy images, and why do we regularly make other images showing their destruction? For short bios of today's panelists, you can check out the website. And for readers in Turkey soon, Aaron Tugendhaft's book will be available in Homer bookstores. About the format of the event, for 45 minutes, our panelists will be presenting, and then we will move on to Q&A. You are welcome to write your questions into the chat box throughout the event. And in the end, because of the time limit, I will be selecting and reading some of your questions out loud to our panelists. Before we start, I would like to mention that all participants' microphones and videos are turned off, and this event is being recorded. Also, we are currently live on Facebook. Enjoy. The floor is yours, Dr. Tugendhaft. I will be leaving for now and we'll be back for the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Naz, and thank you to Anamed for hosting this event. And a special thank you to Ömür and Christy for agreeing to participate and discuss my book this evening or morning, depending on where you are. So I thought I would start by just saying a few words about how this book came about. So as many of you know, there was a video that came out by the Islamic State in February 2015, so showing destruction in the Mosul Museum in Iraq. I was actually at an event in New York at the Institute for the Study of the Ancient World that day. I hadn't been following what was going on. I hadn't checked Facebook all day because I was with some former students who were visiting. And at the lecture, this discussion of this video came up. I quickly went into a corner, checked my phone, and I saw this video. And pretty quickly after seeing the video and sort of thinking about the different people's reactions about what should be done, there's some stills from the video if you're not familiar with it. Pretty quickly, I noticed a similarity between the video and specifically one moment in the video, which is here represented by the still in the middle of the page, and a relief from Sargon II's palace at Khorsabad. So this ancient relief was made 2,500 years earlier than the video, but only 15 miles away from where the video was made, Khorsabad being right next to Mosul. And as you can see, in both images, we have three men with sledgehammers smashing the sculpture of a king lying horizontally. And so I started to think about this uncanny resemblance and started to wonder why this persistent desire to destroy images, as Naz has put it, right? And why the making of images of image destruction, right? So not only the destruction of images, but the making of images of image destruction. And so sort of this initial resemblance is what got me started thinking about working on this topic and writing a book on it. It also was sort of fortunate that it seemed like a number of the different fields that I had been studying up until that point, which from an outsider's view, one might think were very, very disparate. I had done a BA in art history, and then I studied political philosophy and history of religions, and then ended up with a doctorate in Assyriology and was interested in the history of the field of ancient Near Eastern studies. Suddenly, all of those different interests came together in this one video, and I said, well, I have to write something about it. And so I wrote this book that just came out. Before telling you a little bit more about the structure of the book, I should say that there's also a personal element to the project for me. My grandfather was born in Baghdad, and he belonged to a Jewish community that had been living in Iraq since antiquity. And so even though I didn't actually know him very well, and maybe because I didn't know him very well, this project gave me an opportunity to learn a bit more about my own Iraqi heritage. And in thinking about that Iraqi heritage, of course, is part of thinking about why I'm not living in Iraq anymore, and how the Jewish community that my grandfather was a part of, though from a certain perspective in the 1920s, my grandfather was very much involved in building the new Iraq with other Iraqis, Muslims, Christians, Marxists, and it was a very cosmopolitan, very pluralistic place. Still, in 1941, there was a pogrom against Jews, and my grandfather did flee with his family, first to Iran, and then to Tel Aviv, and then eventually to New York, which is where I was born. And so the other theme that I wanted to explore was what makes pluralistic political life possible, and what are the challenges to it, and how might that be related to the role of images in politics and their destruction. And of course, all of this was taking place at a time when Iraq's cosmopolitanism and pluralism was under even more dire threat, with Daesh rampaging through northern Iraq and expelling or killing minority communities of Assyrians and Yazidis. So these themes were on my mind as well, and play a very distinctive, important role in the book, thinking about images and their destruction on the one hand, and the challenges of political plurality on the other, and their interaction. So just briefly, I have here 3 images that represent the 3 chapters of the book. On the left, representing the chapter called Idols, which engages with how the Islamic State in the video, how they present what they're doing, right? They present themselves as destroying idols, and that it is a divine command to destroy idols, and that's what they're doing. Then in the middle, representing the chapter Museums, this is an image of the British Museum from the 19th century, showing the newly acquired Assyrian sculptures in the Assyrian Museum. But the chapter itself is more generally about the fact that the objects that were being destroyed in a museum, that these were objects that were understood by others to be heritage, either international, universal human heritage or Iraqi heritage, depending on who you spoke to or at what time of day you spoke to the same person. And so what was the significance of the fact that this was in a museum, and what is the relationship between ancient Near Eastern art objects and museums since their rediscovery in the mid-19th century? And then finally, on the right, this is an image from my Facebook feed. The video was not, as I said, just what happened was not just the destruction of images, but rather a new image was made and disseminated. It was edited, and it was finely crafted, and it was disseminated to be seen today, disseminated to be seen through social media. And so the final chapter, called Videos, is about the making of images of image destruction, both in antiquity on Assyrian palace walls, and on those much more recent walls, the walls of our social media devices. And so that's a brief overview of the 3 chapters in what is a very short book. And yeah, I think maybe I'll hand things over to Christy, who might have some thoughts to share.
Sure, yeah. I'd love to start off with your first chapter on idols. I was really taken by it. And here you've chosen as the quintessential image an early 14th century painting of Abraham destroying the idols. What is intriguing to this, to my mind, about this image is that the idol that has already fallen to the ground, that has been axed, is still intact and pristine in its gold colors, whereas the other two that are still sitting, that haven't fallen, are oxidized. They look kind of brownish. So it seems like viewers have actually gone in and destroyed them themselves. And of course, Abraham is pristine. So this image is interesting because it is an image of image destruction. And so the problem here doesn't seem to be the image itself, but rather idolatry. And you play around with this idea of image making versus idolatry in your first chapter. And what was particularly creative to my mind in that chapter is that you bring in Al-Farabi, which is not something we see frequently when we talk about idol making and image production in Islamic spheres. A lot has been said about images in Islam, and there's a turn towards Euro-American thinkers, Friedberg and Latour and Harmanşah and company, and instead you're tethering your discussion to Al-Farabi's works, specifically how images are second nature to us, how they make political life possible. And that's such an interesting operation that you've done. And I wanted to ask you, was this a conscientious intellectual operation for you to rely on Farabi? What does Farabi do for you from a theoretical perspective? And putting the prime on Farabi rather than European and American thinkers, is this within your book a way of also rejecting what I might call theoretical imperialism?
Christy, I think that's a really great question, and I'm wondering. I think we lost Aaron. Oh, he's coming back. Oh,
He's
there
back.
he is. Okay.
I'm so sorry. That's just what just happened. Okay, where are we?
Where did you fall off?
Just as you were starting to talk.
Oh, good. So I shall repeat myself. How about that?
Okay, are people still here? Yes, participants seem to still be here. I'm very, very, very sorry that my internet crashed. I hope that doesn't happen again.
Well, less embarrassing for me that it's you and me, but these are the trials and tribulations. I was iconoclasting you, Aaron.
Exactly. I hope you made an image of it.
I recorded all of it, put it on Facebook.
Okay.
No, I was just saying, and I'll recap, is that this image is so interesting as it telescopes all the problems, right? It's an image that records the breaking of idols. And so there's a clear distinction between image making and idol breaking. And there has been a lot said about this image, about idolatry, image making in Islam. And typically we've relied on European and American thinkers of image making and image breaking, like Harmanşah and Friedberg and Latour and company. But the intellectual operation that I found really refreshing and original in your chapter on idols is your reliance on Farabi, because you talk about Farabi on, images making political life possible, how they become second nature to us. So I wanted to ask you a little bit more about what Farabi does for you, and whether this was a purposeful operation for you to reject what I refer to as sort of Euro-American intellectual imperialism, turning to a thinker from within Islam rather than piggybacking on, a tradition that's clearly Euro-American.
So first of all, I think I want to say that I chose Al-Farabi because he's incredibly intelligent, more than anything else, right? So that's, and I certainly hope that maybe one of the things that can result from this book is some people can be introduced to Al-Farabi as a incredibly relevant thinker about media studies, among other things. outside of the realm of Islamic art or in Islamic context as well. I mean, I like to joke that, you know, I've every now and then I look at job postings and I see, you know, a job for a position in media studies that I could possibly apply for, because I'm like doing this. I wrote this book. It's kind of media studies, and they ask, you know, but they ask you who your theorists are, right? And obviously they expect me to say Deleuze, and I feel like if I say Al-Farabi, I'm not going to get the job. And so, but hopefully that can change, right? So there is that. Obviously, I think there was a desire on the part, and this connects to the personal element that I discussed before. There was a desire on my part to put Iraq at the center of each of the chapters. And Al-Farabi, of course, not born in Iraq, but he spent his productive years in Baghdad, and so I think that was another reason why I wanted to turn to him. But like I said, I think the most important thing is that I think he's just really helpful in thinking about the role that images play in politics and the necessity of images for politics. And maybe precisely because he's working in a tradition that is, at least on the surface, claiming that images are not necessary, right? It gives it that much more of a bite to listen to what he's really saying. So in short, just for those of you who may not be familiar with Al-Farabi's writings on politics and on images, I pulled from a number of different works by Al-Farabi to reconstruct, in a sense, a kind of response, right? The chapter imagines what would Al-Farabi have said to Ibrahim and Nimrud in their debate about idols or about images, that is recounted in the Quran and then developed in later Islamic tradition. And basically the thought is that so our basic human nature is such that in order to live well, to achieve a happy life, we need to live communally. We need to live in groups. We aren't the kind of animal that can live a happy life just on our own. But there are challenges to living together, as anyone who has ever tried to live with somebody else knows, right? And that those challenges exist from the level of, you know, a roommate, but then all the way to a political community, and then also as well international, trying to live internationally, right? So there are always these problems, and politics, I tried to present in the book, is a tool that we as human beings have for trying to live together successfully without violence. I mean, that's sort of the aim of politics as I present it in the book. And then Farabi comes in to say that in doing that, in aiming at that, certain types of images are necessary. Images that are going to crystallize certain values and communal aims for the population at large, because the population can't just exist in some type of abstract reason. The alternative to images is some type of pure abstract reason, and that doesn't give a community the stuff necessary to cohere as a group. And so, you know, in a sense, I'm bringing in Farabi precisely because to make the argument that one needs images, and therefore the wish to just destroy images and abandon them immediately, to live free of images, either presented as a way to live just unmediated in relationship to God or unmediated in relationship to truth, right? That's not an available option for us as human beings. That doesn't mean that that images don't raise problems. They raise lots of problems, and that's one of the things that I'm exploring throughout the rest of the book as well. So I'm trying to hold that tension together.
Yeah, thanks so much. We need political images to build life and also to build a semblance of indigeneity or power and legitimacy. And one corpus of images that is also a really strong core of your book is, of course, the images of Saddam Hussein, which I believe you have also as your next slide in your PowerPoint. Right, so many scholars have talked about how Saddam Hussein, in trying to create a unified vision for Iraq of its manifold communities and people, even though, of course, we know that he was quite violent against minority communities, including the Kurds of Halabja. We know that he drew upon the Babylonian heritage, on ancient Near Eastern heritage, and fashioned himself as an Assyrian, a Babylonian king, as Ashurbanipal or Nebuchadnezzar or Hammurabi. And you take in a few of those images, like this one of Saddam on in a chariot with horses and, you know, spearing lions and so on. And I'm wondering, to your mind, how did this co-optation of ancient Middle Eastern heritage by Saddam Hussein then set up kind of a straw man or an image of an adversary or opponent for ISIS to go after? How is the ancient Middle East used by these modern actors and then inadvertently formulated as an antagonist in image form?
Yeah, so it's a great question. I'm going to try to answer it by as briefly as I can, just telling a little bit of the backstory, just so that it's clear that it's not just Saddam, right? That the idea of using local antiquity is something that already started in Iraq with the beginning of the state under King Faisal. It wasn't universally considered to be an appropriate thing. So there were, as I discussed in the book, those of a more pan-Arabist perspective considered the use of heritage that was specific to Iraq and therefore not properly pan-Arab was a move that would go against the aims, the pan-Arabist aims. And so, and then as well, there's an Islamist critique, right? And so it's a complicated story, and I try to tell the story in that complicated way. But to get closer to your point, right? I tell an anecdote in the story, in the book, about how when I was living in Chicago, I mentioned this work that I was doing on ancient Near Eastern objects, and an Iraqi grocer at an Iraqi grocery store, and the Iraqi grocery store owner, you know, who had recently moved to Chicago, I don't know when exactly, you know, told me, oh, that stuff is just all Saddamist propaganda, right? Because it had been so co-opted by Saddam's regime that in a lot of minds, to make a distinction between this image, right, which is what's a billboard outside of Nineveh, I believe. I don't believe it still exists. On the one hand, and the actual ancient objects that were dug out of the ground, right? They became so close, right? To the point that, right, when Saddam was rebuilding sites like Babylon, he was rebuilding them with bricks that had cuneiform inscriptions mentioning him, right? Just as the ancient Babylonian and Assyrian kings would have done as well, right? And so that did, I don't think that that's the only piece of the puzzle in terms of what ISIS, what the object or the antagonist of ISIS was, but certainly I think that the fact that these objects were so much connected to Saddam's propaganda plays a part in the story of what was going on with the video and the destruction.
Thank you so much. Yeah, this is an interesting phenomenon where the regime becomes an idol itself, a taghut, and we see that, of course, in ISIS propaganda. I'm going to hand the baton over to Ömür now. I think you guys will have a chat about some Assyrian reliefs, right?
Absolutely, thank you, Aaron, for involving me in this really fabulous conversation. I just want to, if I may, I just want to say one quick thing about the book in general before we talk about this the Assyrian reliefs as we plan. I just want to say how excited I am about the publication of this book, and I want to really. I want to congratulate you for writing such an inspiring book, and as something that's really, I feel, that's actually rather unique in our field. And speaking of our field, I'm talking about sort of ancient art, medieval art in general, and Near Eastern studies in general, and also maybe, I mean, we can discuss this also as well, but I'm really fascinated by it in terms of how sort of it really establishes this conversation that is very trans-historical, that brings sort of ancient objects, ancient material into sort of into the politics of the imagery within a contemporary context. And so there's often a kind of really, in our disciplines, there's often a rift between, you know, what we study when we study the ancient world. You know, we focus and study the ancient world, and when we're actually called on to kind of really talk about the politics of those imagery in a kind of a contemporary context, we're kind of challenged. And I think this challenge became very clear when ISIS made this video, right? And so when with ISIS's practices, and I felt really very much as an art historian, as someone who writes about ancient buildings and images, I felt really not fully equipped to actually really address this. And so I just want to say how important this book in terms of really tackling and also inviting sort of for academics, as us academics, to think about the politics and ethics of our work, right, of our academic work, and where we place our work in that sense. And so I mean, this ISIS's destructive policies kind of really unraveled a really major challenge, and we're often very, very hesitant about sort of really getting involved in this kind of public discourse and politics. But it just, I think there's a really wonderful statement in page 5 where you say we should cultivate our capacity for politics, and this requires understanding of images. And so I just want to express my enthusiasm of this book doing precisely that, but I think in the last couple of years, and I think there are some questions in the chat about this as well. In the last few years, art historians have risen up to the challenge, and actually some very thoughtful work came out. And I think Aaron, your book is a really wonderful testimony to this, but also people like Christie, who wrote about sort of this kind of politics in the contemporary context. I'm thinking of Finbar Berryflood, and you know, Elliot Kolla, who have really addressed this intersection, and this really resonates with me a lot because of the work of Rebecca Schneider in performance theory. She was my colleague when I was teaching at Brown University, and she has this concept of syncopated time of reenactment, and she writes about sort of Civil War reenactments, and she talks about how particular episodes in history kind of really leaks into the present, and she talks about this in a very intriguing way as a kind of leakage, and I really like this in the sense of how sort of these how these kind of past episodes kind of really inform and leak into the politics within which we sort of operate. So you know, the book's sort of swiftly moves between sort of Assyrian reliefs to Islamic miniatures to contemporary social media, this is, and I feel as a teacher in a higher education, I just find this kind of text incredibly thought-provoking for our students as well. That's what I was saying in the beginning, that it's good. I'm hoping this is going to show up in many syllabi, you know, of art history classes. So yeah. About the Assyrian reliefs, I mean, I think this is really, I'm just so glad that you've brought this image, because your book also reads a kind of a really also an image essay, right? The images within the book also tell a different kind of story, and a very powerful story, and that kind of really trans-historical dialogue conversation actually takes place in the images themselves as well. And so one thing that I taught a seminar with an art colleague of mine, Beata Geisler, at UIC, on pain, suffering, visual media, and pain, suffering, violence, and visual media. It was a graduate seminar for artists and art historians, which was really quite amazing. And one of the questions that actually came up was this, we were reading something by Susan Pollock on the concept of suffering. And I just wanted to sort of really pose this question to you. And the discussion really went really interestingly for me. I had written this one article about ISIS, you know, that was published in 2015 in Near Eastern Archaeology, and I, as a kind of a first-hand reaction to this.
You're much faster than I am, Ömür.
Yeah, I was quick. I don't know. There was this amazing.
It just took me 5 more years, and I think, you know.
Well, you wrote a book. Mine was the short article.
100-page book, but okay.
Right. But I was going to say, well, interestingly, that article really emerged out of a very intense discussion on social media, on Facebook, and I think Christy will remember, with a lot of art historians involved, Stephanie Mulder, I want to mention, and so I really enjoyed writing that, and I had actually an incredible response to that article, which the work of academics are read by very few, handful of people, but that one just really blew. You know, it was really. This is exactly what I think we need to be doing as academics. But to go back to the relief. So the question of suffering sort of emerged in that seminar, and we were thinking about how a lot of the academic work really takes on violence as a research topic, right? And it's really it's important as a way of unraveling kind of these injustices, and ISIS's videos is just really, I see it is really a good example, because it's so much part of this program of destruction and annihilation, right, as you mentioned, which involves the destruction of shrines, holy places, entire villages, sort of trafficking of people. So there's a lot of in this violence, we can read a lot of suffering, and our work becomes, the politics of our work becomes very important. So I wanted to ask the question about, just as a kind of a devil's advocate, I want to raise the question, violence versus suffering, and whether, how does our work as academics working on this kind of representation of violence sort of really can be maybe more, how do we negotiate the existence of violence, right, in this image of the Assyrians sacking an Urartian city, an Urartian temple. That's what we see in this image. And as part of this program, they're deporting people. They are, and they're also smashing statues. And so, but this we could also read this as evidence for suffering. How do we balance our work between sort of really talking about this kind of violence, which is a spectacle in itself, versus suffering as a historical phenomenon. So yeah, I just wanted to sort of really open that up a little bit.
I mean, it's a deep question and profound problem. I'm not sure if I have much to contribute to it, other than I mean, here you're playing devil's advocate, so I'm going to kind of push back, right, and say that I'm hesitant to move into that mode of what I take to be a somewhat moralistic mode of identifying suffering and framing matters as a relationship between oppressor and oppressed with a clear moral tone to it. If anything, I think my work in attempting to recover the political is precisely an attempt to get us out of the moralization of politics, which I think is actually one of the reasons why we're not very good at politics, and as a result of that, more people suffer. So I mean, personally, and this is a kind of Machiavellian point, I would say, but it's precisely in our obsession with our own moral goodness and our desire to be morally good that we do politics very, very badly, and more people suffer as a result. I think that it would be much better if we stopped caring so much about being morally pure and being empathetic, and rather accepted the fact that being a human being is difficult, and that the best we can do is engage in the hard and unsatisfying and unredemptive work of political compromise and accepting the fact that things are never going to be as good as you want them to be. And so that's really, if the book is trying to make a contribution here, it's actually trying to argue that we do better to think from a different angle about these matters. But hey, Christy, do you want to get in on this?
Yeah, sure. This really links up to your notion of tyrannical theatrics, and you kind of zoom out of the book, talking about the fact that it's hard to inhabit that tertiary space in a nexus of contestation, and you've talked in your book about conflict humor and how we have a tendency sometimes to be complicit as scholars by the performance of moral posturing, and it's much harder to inhabit, to occupy that place where you're not on either side. And one place that is not on either side is really the museum, and I think that's slide 12 of your PowerPoint,
okay,
where we see Lamassus in all sorts of different museums, whether it's London or Paris or the Met or in the National Museum of Iraq in Baghdad. And so the careful operation that we have to navigate is to make sure that we don't engage in the form of scholarly shock and awe, right? A vexation operation, to put it in ISIS terms. And so my question to you, in looking at, say, Lamassus being destroyed or transported to other museums or being praised and preserved in Iraq proper, how do we make way for the banal, for the quotidian and the everyday? And how do we then mute some of these more altruist dialogues? And how do we then keep our own complicity in check? Because I think you've done a beautiful job of that in the book, and you've obviously thought about it substantially.
Yeah. So thank you for the question, and this won't be a fully satisfying answer. And so, I mean, you push back and maybe we can talk about it, but at least again, to connect to something that I try to develop in the book is that all images are necessarily partial in the sense of, right, like that they're pushing for something, but more in this, also in the sense, right, that they're only telling part of the story. They're only showing, and even if it's a simple fact of framing, right? If we're talking about still images, for example, right? There's always something, but it's not just that. There's so many different components, and so I think one of the things that happens, I'm trying to connect these themes, right? One of the things that allows for a certain type of binary way of thinking about the world that I think is one of the problems for allowing that space in the middle to exist and to thrive, right? Because you're trying to just polarize it, right? Is that you have you have an image or a set of images that presents things in one way very, very clearly and shuns the alternative. And one of the things that I talk about with respect to social media is precisely how algorithms have been complicit in producing these online worlds for us individually, each of us individually, giving us the images that we want to see, or the ones that reaffirm what we what we want to see, what we want to believe, right? Whether it's the images themselves or the way that the image is framed, right? So it could be the same image. It could be the video from Mosul, the ISIS video from Mosul, right? But when it appears on my feed with the comments and such, right, and it gets framed as the worst disaster in the world, right? It could appear on somebody else's feed who, because of their friends and such, can see it as a brave act of religious purity, right? And then there could be a third stream, by the way, right? And sometimes there's a little bit of overlap between these, right? Of someone says this is a necessary act of anti-imperialist, anti-colonial action, right? So the same image could mean these different things to different groups, but that's part of what it means to get better at understanding images. And that's what's one of the things I'm trying to aim at the book. So in order to get out of that, and we could use, for example, the number of the images here, right? So what is the Iraqi attitude towards lamassus? Well, if we look at the image on the top right, it's one. And if you look at the image on the bottom right, it's the other. Most of the time, someone's only going to circulate one of those images because they're going to choose the image that they want, that illustrates the story and the simple story that they want to tell. And the other one is to be hidden, right? Explained away because it doesn't fit the story. But the problem is that human beings are much more complicated than that. So I'll give you one other example, right? So again, on the left, this is the image from the Illustrated London News showing the Assyrian gallery at the British Museum. And you see people in their very bourgeois attire looking at these objects, a mother teaching her children how to look at these objects in a museum, right? And on the right, the still from the Mosul Museum video. Both of these images are images about how one should comport oneself in a museum. They both teach you how to comport oneself in a museum. They have very different attitudes about what that comportment should be and why it should be that, right? But that's what both of these images are doing. When we look at, if we only see one of them, right, we might not realize that it's purposely hiding something, right? So the image on the left, right, doesn't, if we looked at it on its own, we might not notice that this whole gallery exists on the back of British imperialism and a whole imperialist structure. that allows for a certain segment of humanity to look at certain objects and think of themselves as somehow representative of universal humanity, right? Which is not to say, by the way, that the aspirations to thinking in terms of a universal humanity are necessarily bad, but one has to recognize that there are that there are parts of the story that are being left out. Likewise, on the right, we could look at this image and we could, let's say if we were in favor of it, we could say, yes, this museum is just a part of our oppression and we must destroy it. But it obviously leaves things out as well, right? The fact that as individual human beings, we can gain something of spiritual value through the engagement with works of art or engagement with history, whether it's our own or the history of others, and a whole range of other things that we could come up with as to why maybe museums aren't so evil that they should just all be smashed. However one wants to frame it, the point is that by putting these two images next to each other, as I do in the book, by tapping them against each other, as I say, pulling on a phrase from late work by Nietzsche, each of them can start to reveal what it otherwise leaves hidden. And finally, sorry, this was a long answer to your question, but I think that the goal here is that if we do that work, if we do that hard work of not just accepting an image for what it claims on its claim on us, but actually think through it, but think through images, not only the images that we want to tear down in our minds, right? Because we think that they don't belong to the politics we want or whatever, but do that with all images, even the ones that we might be inclined to want to believe the false story that they tell. If we can actually do that, then we're going to be better equipped to do that work of politics, of living in that messy space together. That's a lot to work. I mean, and to be honest with you, at the end of having written this book, I feel like there's something deeply naive about the book, but nevertheless, maybe hopeful as well.
Can I add something quickly to what you were saying, Aaron? I think I mean this really technique of tapping the image is just really so great, and actually some people have tapped the one on the right, and one of the things that image of ISIS militants destroying sort of Hellenistic sculpture really reveals is also that the one thing that it is hiding is actually this kind of the fact that ISIS was actually very much involved in the kind of overall looting and selling of antiquities and making a lot of income from it, and so that the image itself and so in both images actually is just really have this really interesting political economy that there are sort of screening, and so maybe as the result of those political economies, and so I just wanted to point that out with the one on the right, as you were kind of really tapping both of them, which was really great.
Yeah, and the other issue with both images is that we have the question of consumership. And this is something that Ömür has talked about, that with a print media, we might be looking at this material quite passively. Whereas with this video that was made for release and speciation on social media, the viewer is actually freelancing and literally for free for ISIS, spreading this thing. And like Ömür said, it wasn't an act of recoil, and people were, there's a demand for this snuff stuff, agitprop, whatever you want to call it. And so viewers are part of the chain of multiplication, and therefore even scholars are part of this chain of complicity, if only, talking about it. And this is really the issue we have when we tap into images, or we think about what isn't seen or what we do not know about them. Sometimes we do not even know what we're doing in that mix.
So I mean, just to add an added complication, for sure, right? I mean, as Ömür just said, right, that there are claims that ISIS was involved in the antiquities trade. One could even say that this video was meant to advertise antiquities, right? So basically, get them while they're still they're still around, kind of thing, right? So it's a good advertising technique for selling those that didn't get smashed. And so one could say that yes, by spreading the image around, one is helping ISIS get make some cash, right? But I think on top of that, and this is something that I explore a bit at the end of the book, is the fact that by clicking on these images and videos and comments, by liking and sharing and doing all those things that we do now all the time on Facebook or Twitter or whatever, we are providing the platform owners with data, right? And that data, right? So for however much ISIS might have gotten wealthy by spreading this video around, right? Mark Zuckerberg got even wealthier. And what's really insidious, and this is what I want to now call, I didn't call it in the book, I didn't use this phrase, but I now call algorithmic iconoclasm. It is something that takes, oh, are you frozen?
I think we lost Aaron again.
Yeah, I think his internet has wafted out there.
Right.
I think he'll be able to hop back on.
Hopefully, yeah.
In the meantime, Ömür, I've always wanted to ask you that question. You talk about how our reaction as humans to those videos are not an act of recoil. We're actually really drawn to these images of violence and suffering. What do you think is undergirding that kind of morbid fascination?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question, and Aaron, honestly, I think goes on really sort of unpacks that a little bit. I feel in the videos chapter, particularly going into these kind of the visual culture of video games, and I don't really, I don't really know in terms of how violence sort of really is drawn. I recently gave a paper where, I mean, this is one of the things that I was discussing is what I think John Paul Ricoeur calls kind of a pornography of violence as something that people are kind of really drawn. And Nicholas Mirzoeff has also, Nicholas Mirzoeff has really beautifully written, especially I think about the Abu Ghraib photographs and the kind of proliferation of visual media and visuality in this kind of in this era of visualization. And so yeah, I think
Judith Butler and company. I see Aaron. Right. Can you hear us? Are you back?
Yes,
on?
I'm back. I
Great
apologize.
to have you back.
Of course, this is exactly when my internet breaks. When I'm teaching, I teach online every day, right? And that's when I would love it to break down, so that way I wouldn't have to teach. But then the internet always remains strong. But what can you do?
So, I think we're getting towards the end of our time for the conversation. Yeah. I don't know if you want to share your screen again, since we lost you. Your screen was lost, your PowerPoint.
So are there any images that you think we should put up, or should we just stick it?
I thought maybe we could, we've talked so much about pain and suffering and breaking of images that maybe we could end on those cartoons, because I did want to ask you a question about the role of laughter.
Okay, so give me 1 second. Should we open this up? Right, here you go.
Yeah, that one. Yeah. When you talk about these subjects, it's always nice to sort of zoom out in more positive, uplifting ways. And you take on some of the ISIS cartoons. On the left, you've got Michael Jackson, Steven Spielberg, and Daesh for, you know, great acting and cinematic skills, you know, the Hollywood stars. The middle cartoon, it, you know, makes a mockery of those execution videos, which were rehearsed. The lighting was tested. It was done so many times that the prisoners didn't even expect to be killed by, you know, even when the time did come. And of course, on the right, you've got the cartoon of the Facebook sword, as Facebook as the ultimate weapon of Daesh, of ISIS. So there's a lot of scholarship on the role of humor, especially conflict humor, comic relief, right? And Freud calls this a cathetic release, an expenditure of stress and tension that comes out in a conflict context. And to what extent do you think cartoons are actually serving that purpose of creating binaries, of drawing sharper lines of conflict in a muddled context, of doing what ISIS calls, right, of extinguishing that gray zone? Right.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. I wish I had the exact reference. There's completely unrelated to ISIS, but there was a great piece by excuse me, by John Baskin, the editor of The Point, on comedy and the role of comedy, and how actually in the age of Trump, how so much comedy has precisely is not doing its proper political work, which is allowing us to make fun of ourselves, but rather always in the form of a kind of making fun of the other in a way that is actually, as you say, not breaking down that binary, but reinforcing the binary. And so I think that it's a complicated issue, right? Where if you're only making fun of the other and you don't ever take that look at yourself in that way, right? It is. I think that there's that's a real challenge. I mean, the truth is, this is a theme that I'd like to continue exploring, that I don't explore as much in this book, but I think that this question of play and playfulness and how we can become more playful with our commitments, and in a sense, that idea of tapping images, rather than being so serious as to think that you either have to smash them and get rid of them, or you need to worship them, submit oneself to them totally, right? But rather that human agency can exist in this more playful space that engages with them in a more playful way, and therefore I would think also a more thoughtful way. This is precisely a theme that I'm hoping to explore. So maybe, I don't know if it does this or not, but I'll share one image that a mashup that I put together here, which is not in the book, but belongs to a work in progress called Jihadists at Play. And I think that this is another possibly good example of tapping. These are a number of images of Daesh and a number of images from Burning Man. And I will just let people think about what happens when one puts Daesh and Burning Man together in this way. I'm not entirely certain yet, but this is something that I'm thinking about, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you so much. Ömür, do you have any sort of final question before we hand it off to Naz?
No, I think we have little time left. I think maybe we could take some questions from the chat.
Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing, and then if the questions suggest that we should get the image back up, we can do that.
Sorry. Back again. Okay. Before we move on to questions, I should say that it was a lovely talk. Thank you. We have two questions currently. One is from Julia, our current fellow to Dr. Harmanşah, actually. I'm just going to read, and it's already shared with everyone, so I'm reading. This goes in the direction of what Dr. Harmanşah said, referring to Barsani and Dutoit's forms of violence, narrative in Assyrian art and modern culture. It is important to reflect the violent gaze also in ancient times and to discuss the ethics in archaeology when speaking of the artistic elaboration of the reliefs. Also, the destruction of archaeological remains seem to be more shocking to the Western public than the killing of people. How can archaeology engage with that and take a position?
Yeah, thank you. Aaron, do you want to comment, or shall I take it on?
Go ahead.
All right.
Maybe we'll see if I can piggyback if I want.
Maybe you'll jump. Yeah. Yes. Thank you so much. I've read and thought about Barsani and Dutoit's forms of violence, which is a really important and kind of also a very interesting work. And I was thinking especially about how the kind of violence that we see. I mean, this is one fascinating discussion that Aaron's book provokes, right? Thinking about violence in Assyrian reliefs versus thinking of violence today that we see in social media, produce something like heritage violence that's produced by ISIS. And I'm thinking about particularly these two different the status of the sort of ontology of violence, right? And so Elizabeth Povinelli in her book Geontologies really starts with this discussion of sovereign power versus biopower, right? And so she talks about how in sort of really before industrial modernity, there's this idea of the carnival of death is just so important, right? And that as a kind of a spectacle of state, of the power to kill. And so I've always kind of really read this, the Assyrian reliefs in this kind of idea of carnival of death, which kind of really uses sort of violence as a form of a state spectacle, but also a kind of a humiliation of the local community, a kind of a form of humiliation. Image making is a form of humiliation of local communities, right? And establishing and imposing this imperial discourse. And then actually in the 20th century, if you think of like the Foucaultian idea of biopower and biopolitics, the politics has actually moved towards a more subtle forms of oppression. And so to get violence like ISIS performs, right, in the age of biopolitics is shocking to us because it reverts back to this kind of sovereign power, this carnival of death, right? It does that work. And I feel like ISIS as a phenomenon is part of this kind of dismantling of secular modernity, dismantling of the institutions of modernity, and actually reverting back a kind of violence that is that we associate more in kind of really with European kings or something like that, and so, which is really quite fascinating. But Povinelli also makes the point of like these are not evolutionarily move one from the other; they both exist all the time together, and so so I mean I guess. What I'm trying to say is just really, and I think Aaron's book really plays with these different forms of power and different forms of violence, and puts them right next to each other. Right, this is just so exciting precisely to do that in terms of thinking about these different forms of violence and how states actually mobilize that violence. If that makes sense.
So now, as I see that there's you go ahead with the next question. I ended up losing the chat when my computer crashed, but I see Monica's question, but I don't see the previous ones.
Yeah, before we had one more question from Madison Leeson, actually. She asked, she said that Benjamin Ayse Khan's article, How to Interpret ISIS Heritage Destruction, was published in 2018. And she said, which was likely during the writing of your book, Aaron. And he also asked questions around images of destruction of images. How influential was this article for you, if at all? And she said she hasn't read your book yet, but does Ayse Khan's work in general inform your arguments?
So when one is embarrassed to get questions like this, I'm not familiar with the work, I'll be honest. This project, actually, I finished writing in 2017, so it's been a long time before it actually came out. But yeah, so beginning of 2018. So I'm afraid I can't. But maybe one of the other panelists can give a more informed opinion.
Anything you would like to add? Okay. Let's move on to the next question then. Now I see Monica's question. Palmero. She's saying that there's this question that she's bugging her since 2014, and she hasn't had the chance to read your book, but she's asking, before the destruction of Mosul Museum, but after ISIS blew up Nabi Yunus, John Kerry made a public statement in the Met Museum with the Egyptian temple standing behind him. And the context was the exhibition Assyria to Iberia. How would you contextualize this staged image of protection, defense, debatable as these concepts might be, and contrast it with the subsequent staged image of destruction in the Mosul Museum? What are the power dynamics embedded in such an exchange?
So it's a great question. So I don't write about that particular statement by Kerry in the book, though I am aware of it and I have some things to say about it. A more recent article I can just make a plug for if you're interested. You can find it on Cabinet Magazine's website. It's called Archaeology and Jihad in Cabinet Magazine. Maybe Naz, if you can find it and you can put it in the chat online. But I do deal with a similar issue with a more recent exhibition at the Louvre in terms of some of the politics related to how these issues have come up in museums since, so in the wake of this destruction, and how museums have framed issues and have left certain issues aside. That's with respect to museum exhibitions. That's the response to the Assyria to Iberia part of the question. More importantly, though, one thing that I do try to develop in the book is how just as there's a problem in my mind in ISIS's presentation of a kind of world without images, a kind of purified world that is meant to stand, opposed to a world of apostates, and again in the sense of no gray zone in between, right? But separating the two, and then this is what I explore in the Idols chapter, where the image of Ibrahim, who I present as naively thinking that he can achieve a regime without images, right? And using Al-Farabi to show that that's naive, right? That you can't have this type of regime without images. In the second chapter, I develop an argument, and I think this connects to what Kerry said, because if I remember correctly, Kerry, as many other people were at the time, framed the issues in terms of civilization versus barbarism. And it's precisely that dichotomy of civilization versus barbarism that I also take deep issue with in the book, and precisely in the second chapter. And for me, this is actually the other side of the same coin in a lot of ways, in that if one thinks of the story of Ibrahim smashing the idols as this hope to get beyond politics or escape politics, and the kind of humanness, like nitty gritty and imperfection of politics, by somehow being able as a community, not as an individual, but as a community, to sort of be in an unmediated way with God, right? And that, I discussed this as an attempt to escape, a desire to escape politics. So too, we can think about this idea of civilization, this notion of a kind of shared humanity or civilization, as likewise embedded in a dream of escaping politics. And I in the book, I connect this to the dream of getting to the other side of the events of the Tower of Babel. That the Tower of Babel, right before the Tower of Babel, supposedly we were all united, right, and that we could somehow get back to that. But the problem with that, right, is that there's always a remainder, and those who don't want to get back to that suddenly then become the barbarians, and that this dichotomy between the civilization and barbarism is no more insidious, or so no less insidious than the dichotomy between believers and apostates. If I can just, sorry, I'll take one more second to just share an anecdote that I quote in the story, because I think it ties this issue precisely to ancient Mesopotamia in an important way. So a story is told about the 70th birthday of the French poet Victor Hugo, and he's sitting there, and ambassadors from every country come to pay their respects to the great poet. And so first the ambassador from England comes, and Hugo is told it's the ambassador from England, and Hugo says, "England, ah, Shakespeare." And then the ambassador from Spain comes, and he says, "Spain, ah, Cervantes." And then the ambassador from Germany comes, "Germany, ah, Goethe," right? And then the ambassador from Mesopotamia comes. And at first, Victor Hugo is taken aback. He doesn't exactly know, what is he supposed to say? How does he react to this? And then he lights up and he says, "Mesopotamia, ah, humanity." That tying together, right, this idea that somehow Mesopotamia is this pre-political, pure, universal humanity, right? For all that there might be something beautiful in that image, there's also something very troubling in that image and in that idea. And so I think that we need to bear that in mind.
Okay, we have more questions. One of them is from Faik Can Lüleci. He's asking about the last mashup picture. He's asking that, shall we think it is a comparison of opposites, like ideal or orgastic? I tell this referring to Eric Newman's history of consciousness. This being purely spiritual, idealistic, and towards Father, while the other is chaotic, earth, and towards Mother. Might they be defining each other in that sense?
Nice. I mean, in a way, I just want to. So I love the fact that already the image is generating and generating thought. And I think I actually prefer to just stay silent. Thank you for these thoughts. I'm going to keep them in mind as I continue to think about that next project. But I love the idea, right, that by putting images next to each other that one might not normally think should be next to each other, such ideas can be generated. So I'm happy about this comment. I'm going to turn the question into a comment and be pleased.
And maybe one last question before we finish. There's one left, Fahri Dikkaya. He's asking, have you been thinking anything about relationship between Islamic theology and ISIS destruction? If you think, how does it work? Okay.
So great question. To a certain extent, I'll refer you to the first chapter of the book where I deal with some of this, at least. The other place I've been thinking about it, and this is in a way touched on in the third chapter on videos, but it's also something that I would try to expand in this next project on play if I end up doing it, and it has to do with the appeal of video games, first-person shooter video games. So a lot of people mentioned that ISIS videos look like or look like popular first-person shooter video games. And I actually hired a student of mine to identify segments of from Call of Duty that resemble ISIS. I had to get him to sign a release that he would not join the Islamic State by watching all of these videos, and I had him do this work for me because I'm an awful player at these games. I mention this because this is going to be just a weird. You're going to think this is a crazy answer to this question, but okay, I'm taking the risk. So. Most of the discussion of those videos, again, was very kind of instrumental, right? ISIS uses these videos or makes video games or makes videos that look like video games because it's trying to appeal to young people who love video games. I think that's fine as far as it goes. But I was trying to think a little bit deeper, a little bit more philosophically about what is the appeal and what is it like to inhabit a video game, and precisely inhabit a first-person shooter video game where your local motion is available to you, right? You can go left, right, and do these types of things. But the goal of your action, right, is set for you in terms of what your objective is. And there's no place for judgment about the objective. Either you accept it, either you play, in which case you accept the objective, right? Or you don't play, but you can't sort of do the deepest work of political thinking, which is to actually make judgments about the good. That's something that's missing in video games. So how does any of this connect to Islamic theology? Well, I mean, this is the thing. I'm not I'm not an expert enough, but I am actually interested in how some of the structure of Islam, these video games resembles in certain interesting ways, especially Asharite theology. And so this is, anyway, this is one of the things that I'm thinking about. Of course, it's complicated about, there's a whole bunch of complications. And so, I know, and Christy, I'm sure would have much smarter things to say on this subject than I do. And so, but I want to learn more, let's put it that way.
Maybe I can say just a few words there. The caveat with Islamic theology and ISIS image destruction is that Islamic theological the reservoir is extremely deep, very muddled. And when we look at ISIS, they do something I call cherry picking theology, where they already have a position and then they dipped into the reservoir and find the hadith or the Quranic verses that sustain a predetermined position. So that's not a theology by deduction, it's theology by induction. And I think that's a great question to end on, because in the end, people like Aaron, scholars who really think deeply about this material, have to proceed by deduction and not induction. And that's where the muddled complexity of the third space position is, I think, the most fruitful. So I just want to say thank you again to Aaron for such a brilliant book. It's been a pleasure to read it and to hear you speak about it.
Thank you for that comment, Christy. I think that's a really important point to make sure that came through and at the end here. So thank you for that. And thank you, Christy and Ömür, for engaging this book in such deep ways and in such generous ways. So I appreciate that. So
do you have any final thoughts you would like to add before we finish?
I just want to thank Aaron as well for both just writing such an inspiring book and also opening up a conversation about it, and so I truly enjoyed this conversation. Also with Christy as well, and your thoughts, Christy. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and thank you to Ahmed for bringing us all together. Thank you, Naz, Chris,
it was
everybody.
So hopefully, right. I mean, the only thing I can say, especially to those, to those of you who are watching from Turkey and from Istanbul, I certainly hope to be able to actually physically return to Istanbul sometime soon. I had a wonderful time, my time there, and so I'm hoping to be able to return sometime soon.
Yeah, hopefully. And I also would like to thank you, to our panelists, for this wonderful talk, and to our participants for joining us during this Monday morning, afternoon, night, wherever you are. Thank you, and please stay safe.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you all.
Bye.
Thank you.